In 1612, the most powerful man in Europe was rotting alive on his throne. Syphilis had eaten his face. Mercury was dissolving his brain. Locked in the dark, smelling of gangrene and screaming at ghosts, Emperor Rudolf II was no longer a king. He was a biological horror story. This is the terrifying end of the Habsburg madman. Before the ruin, there was the dream. When Rudolf moved the imperial court to Prague in 1583, he wasn't simply building a capital, he was building a sanctuary for the mind. His castle became a massive sprawling brain, a legendary Kunstkammer filled with clockwork, automata, Renaissance masterpieces, and monsters preserved in jars. He sought to bridge the gap between the God-made and the man-made. However, genetics was merely the kindling. The match itself was struck somewhere in the pleasure quarters of Europe, perhaps in Spain during his youth or later in Vienna. It was called the French disease, the Neapolitan sickness, or the Great Pox. In the blame game of international politics, everyone named it after their enemies. Today we know it as syphilis. In the late 16th century, syphilis was a raging, terrifying scourge that tore through the aristocracy of Europe like wildfire. It was the shadow side of the Renaissance's embrace of earthly pleasures, a grim reminder of mortality hidden in the bedsheets of princes and paupers alike. The bacterium Treponema pallidum is a spiral-shaped organism, a corkscrew that burrows into the flesh, moving with a terrifying purpose. The first stage of the infection was deceptively mild, easy for a man of Rudolf's stature to ignore or dismiss as a minor ailment. A small, painless sore, known as a chancre, would appear at the site of infection. It was firm, round, and seemingly harmless. For a young prince, surrounded by sycophantic doctors who were terrified to deliver bad news, this mark could be explained away as friction, a heat rash, or a minor imbalance of the humors. The sore would vanish after a few weeks, leaving no scar. The body seemed to have healed itself. It was a biological lie. The disease had not left. It had simply gone underground. The second stage was harder to miss, and it likely struck Rudolf as he was establishing his golden court in Prague. The bacteria had entered the bloodstream, disseminating to every organ in his body. He would have experienced fevers that came and went without reason, a profound fatigue that made the simple act of dressing in his heavy imperial robes feel like lifting a mountain. A rash would appear, often on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, copper-colored spots that did not itch but signaled that the blood itself was tainted. Hair began to fall out in clumps, a condition known as alopecia, forcing men to wear wigs and women to retreat indoors. But the most excruciating symptom of this stage was the bone pain. It was a terrible aching agony in the long bones of the arms and legs, a pain that worsened at night. Medical texts of the time described it vividly, comparing it to a dog gnawing on the shin bone, a relentless, dull pressure that made sleep impossible. The ruler of the Holy Roman Empire paced the floors of his bedchamber in the dead of night, the stone cold against his bare feet, clutching his arms as if trying to hold his own skeleton together. The pain was deep, resonating in the marrow, a constant reminder that something foreign was alive inside him. The court physicians were summoned. These were men of high learning, steeped in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, who believed that health was a balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Confronted with the emperor's symptoms, the rash, the hair loss, the nocturnal bone agony, they knew exactly what they were dealing with. They knew it was the pox, But one does not simply tell an emperor that he is rotting from a venereal disease. Instead, they spoke of melancholic humors and rheumatic fevers. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and dietary changes. But as the pain persisted, as the rheumatism failed to yield to herbal poultices and prayer, Rudolf turned to the one discipline he trusted more than theology, more than politics, more than anything else: alchemy. In the alchemical worldview that Rudolf obsessed over, the universe was composed of correspondences. As above, so below. If the body was sick, it was because the internal chemistry was out of alignment. To treat the great pox, Europe's alchemists and doctors relied on one substance above all others. It was the only thing that seemed to possess the violence necessary to counter the virulence of the disease. It was mercury, quicksilver, the living metal. Mercury was seductive. It was the only metal that was liquid at room temperature, shimmering and heavy, moving with an unnatural viscosity. In alchemy, it was a primal substance, representing the fluid, transformative spirit of matter. It made sense to the pre-modern mind that something so powerful, so magical, could burn the disease out of the body. The great medical iconoclast Paracelsus, a man whose writings Rudolf revered and collected, had famously championed mercury as a cure for syphilis. He believed that the poison of the disease could only be neutralized by a stronger poison. The logic was sound in a twisted way. Mercury does kill the syphilis bacteria in a petri dish. It is a potent antiseptic. But the physicians of the 17th century had no concept of safe dosage. Their approach was brute force. The patient was saturated in it. You had to become the metal to be cured. Rudolf, the emperor with the greatest alchemical laboratories in the world at his disposal, had access to the purest, strongest mercury preparations money could buy. And so, around the turn of the century, as the year 1600 approached, the emperor began the slow, agonizing process of self-erasure. He was signing a contract with the devil far worse than the disease he was trying to flee. The treatment regimens were brutal. The most common method was ingestion. Mercury was mixed with fats, honey, or wine to mask the metallic taste, creating a gray sludge that the patient had to swallow daily. But swallowing was only one route. If the digestion failed, there was the rubbing cure. The emperor was stripped bare in a warm room. His doctors, wearing leather gloves to protect their own skin, would take handfuls of mercurial ointment, a mixture of mercury, lard, turpentine, and sulfur, and vigorously rub it into the emperor's skin. They rubbed it into his inner thighs, his armpits, the soles of his feet, anywhere the skin was thin and absorbent. The goal was to force the metal into the blood. If that wasn't enough, there was the fumigation cabinet. This was a torture device masquerading as a medical tool. The patient was placed inside a wooden box or a tent, with only their head sticking out. Beneath the seat, a brazier of hot coals was lit. The doctors would throw cinnabar, red mercury ore, onto the coals. As the ore burned, it released thick purple clouds of toxic mercury vapor. The vapor would fill the box, coating the patient's sweating skin, entering every pore, while they inhaled the fumes that inevitably leaked out. The immediate goal of these treatments was to induce ptyalism, extreme salivation. The medical theory of the time held that the disease resided in the phlegm and the corrupted humors of the body. Therefore, to cure the disease, one had to expel the fluids. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin that triggers the salivary glands to go into overdrive. It was considered a sign of success when the patient began to drool. And drool they did. Patients undergoing the mercury cure would produce pints, sometimes quarts, of saliva a day. It was a thick, ropey, foul-smelling slime that tasted of metal. The man who claimed dominion over vast territories sat in his velvet chair, leaning over a golden basin, drooling uncontrollably for hours on end. The dignity of the crown was stripped away, layer by layer. The majestic beard that Rudolf wore in his portraits became matted and foul. He had to keep a cloth constantly at his mouth. Speaking became a wet, slurping struggle. But the saliva was just the beginning. Mercury is a heavy metal. It does not simply pass through the body. It accumulates. It binds to the proteins in the cells, destroying the enzymes that keep the body alive. It settles in the kidneys, the liver, and most disastrously, the brain. As the months of treatment turned into years, the side effects began to manifest with horrifying clarity. The first casualty was the mouth. Mercury attacks the mucous membranes and the bone of the jaw. Rudolph's gums began to turn a sickly blue-black color. They became spongy and inflamed, bleeding at the slightest touch. Eating became an ordeal of agony. The soft tissue of the mouth began to ulcerate, developing gray, dead patches that smelled of rotting meat. This condition, known as mercurial stomatitis, was so severe that the breath of the patient became unbearable to others. The smell of power in the corridors of Prague was literally the smell of the emperor's rotting mouth. Then the teeth began to go. They loosened in their sockets as the bone of the jaw softened. One by one, the emperor's teeth would wobble and fall out, or had to be pulled free by surgeons to drain the abscesses beneath them. The structure of his face began to change. The proud Habsburg jaw, already a deformity, became a ruin. Without teeth to support the lips and cheeks, his face began to sink in, giving him the appearance of a premature old man. He stopped smiling. He stopped eating in public. He began to dine alone behind locked doors, ashamed of the slurping noises he made while trying to swallow soft broths and mashed foods. Along with the physical rot came the neurological devastation. Mercury attacks the central nervous system, specifically the cerebellum, which controls fine motor skills. The mercurial tremors began. It started in the fingers, a slight rhythmic twitching that made holding a quill pen difficult. It was a subtle vibration, like a tuning fork struck against a table. But soon, it spread. The tremors moved up the arms to the shoulders, then to the legs. The emperor, once an avid horseman and a delicate handler of scientific instruments, found himself shaking uncontrollably. He could not hold a goblet of wine without spilling it down his tunic. He could not adjust the lenses of his beloved telescopes. He would reach for a book, and his hand would dance and jerk away from the target. To mask this, he began to move less. He became rigid, holding his body stiffly to suppress the shaking. He walked with a shuffling gait, terrified of stumbling. The active, curious man was becoming a statue, frozen by his own poisoned nerves. And yet, despite the horror of the treatment, the Syphilis did not die. The mercury suppressed the symptoms for a time, driving the rash away, easing the bone pain slightly, but the spire cheat was merely retreating deeper into the one fortress the mercury was simultaneously destroying: the brain. While the body was breaking, the mind was beginning to fray. Mercury poisoning induces a very specific type of psychiatric disturbance known as erethism. In later centuries, this would be observed in hat makers who used mercury to cure felt, giving rise to the phrase "mad as a hatter." The symptoms are profound social anxiety, pathological shyness, irritability, and paranoia. Rudolf had always been melancholic and reserved, but now, under the influence of the metal, his personality began to fracture. He developed a terror of being looked at. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if his skin were made of glass. He began to cancel audiences with ambassadors, leaving them waiting in the antechambers for weeks. He refused to see his ministers. He retreated deeper into the labyrinth of the castle, surrounding himself only with his valets, his alchemists, and his artists, people who were paid to tolerate his decay. He began to suspect plots everywhere. The shadows in the corners of his rooms seemed to move. The whispers of the servants sounded like conspiracies. Was his brother Matthias plotting against him? He was. Was the Pope sending assassins? Were his food tasters loyal? The paranoia was fed by the reality of his political situation, but it was amplified 1,000 times by the toxins in his brain. He was losing the ability to distinguish between the political threats to his crown and the phantoms generated by his dying neurons. By 1605, the golden age of Prague was beginning to tarnish. The city outside was still vibrant, a hub of commerce and science, but the heart of the empire was sick. The emperor was vanishing. He was becoming a ghost in his own palace, a figure glimpsed only in shadows, smelling of death, shaking with palsy, his mouth a ruin of black gums and missing teeth. And the worst was yet to come. The Syphilis, having survived the mercury bombardment, was preparing its final, most grotesque assault. It was no longer content with the blood and the skin. It wanted the bones. It wanted the face. By the year 1605, the silence within the imperial apartments of the Radchany had deepened, becoming as heavy and suffocating as the velvet drapes that were drawn tight against the sun. The emperor was no longer merely hiding. He was vanishing. The mercury treatments, which had been intended to purge the great pox from his system, had instead ravaged his nervous system, leaving him trembling, toothless, and prone to fits of terrifying anxiety. But if the mercury was a hammer that shattered the emperor's composure, the disease itself was a slow-moving chisel, chipping away at the very structure of the man. The treponema pallidum spirituit had survived the chemical assault. It had retreated into the deep tissues, into the bones and the brain, waiting for the host's immune system to falter. Now, in the third and final act of the infection, what modern medicine calls tertiary syphilis, the bacteria began to manifest its most grotesque creation, the gumma. A gumma is a biological horror. It is a soft, rubbery tumor, a granuloma formed by the body's desperate, failing attempt to wall off the infection. It is a mass of dead tissue, inflammation, and fibrous scars that can appear anywhere, on the liver, in the heart, on the skin. But in cases like Rudolf's, the gummas had a cruel predilection for the skeletal structure of the face and the skull. It began innocuously enough, perhaps as a persistent dull ache behind the bridge of the nose, a pressure that no amount of blowing or sneezing could relieve. The emperor likely complained of a stuffy head, a symptom his physicians would have attributed to the damp air of Prague or an excess of phlegm. They would have prescribed more steam baths, more inhaling of herbal vapors, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of a structural collapse. Inside the nasal cavity, the gumma was quietly eating. It attacked the mucous membranes first, creating ulcers that refused to heal, weeping a foul-smelling discharge that mixed with the blood from his mercury-ravaged gums. Then it moved to the cartilage, the septum, the wall of cartilage that divides the nostrils and supports the nose, began to necrose. It died, turning from firm, living tissue into a gray, mushy pulp. One morning, while washing his face or perhaps simply blowing his nose into a fine linen handkerchief, the structure gave way. The bridge of the nose, unsupported from within, collapsed. It sank inward, creating the classic saddle nose deformity, that was the scarlet letter of the syphilitic in the 17th century. For a man like Rudolf, whose life was defined by aesthetics, by the appreciation of beauty and form, this was a catastrophe that transcended physical pain. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, the vicar of Christ on earth, the heir to the Caesars. And now, when he looked in the mirror, a monster looked back. His face, once painted by the great masters, with an air of melancholy dignity, was now disfigured, flattened, and bestial. But the destruction did not stop at the nose. The gummas were relentless. They ate downward, attacking the hard palate, the bony roof of the mouth that separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. The bone here is thin, and the gumma perforated it with terrifying ease. A hole formed, connecting his mouth directly to his nose. The implications of this injury were horrific. The simple human act of eating became a torture. When the emperor tried to drink wine or swallow soup, the liquid would not stay in his throat. It would regurgitate upward, force through the hole in his palate, and out through his collapsed nose. His voice, already slurred by the loss of his teeth and the tremors in his tongue, changed completely. The resonance of the skull was broken. His speech became a hollow nasal croak, a sound that was difficult to understand and painful to listen to. He sounded less like a king and more like a ruin. The smell that permeated his private chambers intensified. Necrosis is the death of tissue, and dead tissue rots. The emperor carried the scent of his own decay with him. It was a fetid, sweet, sour odor of gangrene that no amount of incense or pomander balls could mask. His valets, men who had served him for decades, had to steel themselves before entering his presence, holding breaths or pressing perfumed cloths to their faces, a gesture that must have cut the paranoid emperor to the quick. Is it any wonder, then, that Rudolf II became the invisible emperor? He refused to be seen. The shame was absolute. He ceased all public processions. He stopped attending Mass in the St. Vitus Cathedral, terrified that the common people would see the face of their monarch and recoil in horror. He denied audiences to foreign ambassadors, men who had traveled for weeks across Europe to secure treaties or negotiate marriages. They were left to cool their heels in the antechambers, staring at the frescoes, while the man they sought cowered behind double-locked doors a few hundred feet away. The diplomatic dispatches from this period are filled with confusion and frustration. Venetian envoys wrote home describing a court in paralysis. "The emperor is indisposed," was the official line, repeated day after day, month after month. Rumors began to swirl in the capitals of Europe. Was he dead? Was he being held prisoner by his valets? Was he bewitched? Some whispered that he had turned to black magic and had been struck down by God for his hubris. The truth that he was simply a man ashamed of his own rotting face was far more tragic than any supernatural explanation. Locked away in the lion's court and the private wings of the castle, Rudolf surrounded himself with a new kind of courtier. He banished the polished diplomats and the ambitious nobles. In their place, he embraced the artisans, the alchemists, and the makers of machines. He developed a profound obsession with automata, complex clockwork mechanisms that mimicked life. His collection included mechanical ships that rolled across tables, clocks that charted the movement of the planets with mathematical precision, and statues that could move their eyes and hands. He spent hours watching them, fascinated by their perfection. There was a cruel irony in this. These machines were cold, metal, and soulless, yet they were perfect. Their gears did not rot. Their faces did not collapse. They obeyed the laws of mechanics without complaint. They were everything he was not. He found comfort in the predictable ticking of a clockwork universe, because his own biological universe had descended into chaos. He also clung to his alchemists with a desperation that bordered on mania. The search for the philosopher's stone shifted. It was no longer about turning lead into gold to fill the imperial treasury. Rudolf didn't care about money anymore. He wanted the panacea. He wanted the elixir of life. He demanded that his alchemists work through the night, keeping the furnaces roaring, distilling mercury and sulfur again and again, looking for the red powder that could regenerate bone and flesh. He would visit their laboratories in the dead of night, a cloaked figure shuffling through the corridors, his face hidden behind a heavy cowl. He would watch the experiments with feverish intensity, his trembling hands clutching a vial of some new hopeful concoction. He drank strange distillations of gold, pearls, and crushed gemstones, hoping that the purity of these materials would transfer to his own corruption. But biology is not sympathetic to metaphors. The pearls did not rebuild his teeth. The gold did not patch the hole in the roof of his mouth. While his body was collapsing, the syphilis was launching its final assault on the citadel of his mind. Neurosyphilis, specifically the condition known as general paresis of the insane, creates a very specific constellation of psychiatric symptoms. It affects the frontal lobes of the brain, the seat of judgment, personality, and inhibition. Rudolf's melancholia, always a part of his character, mutated into something darker and more volatile. He began to experience rapid cycling of moods. One moment he would be catatonic, sitting in his chair for hours, staring at a spot on the wall, tears streaming down his ruined face, paralyzed by a sadness so deep it felt like a physical weight. The next moment he would fly into a rage. The mercury madness, the timidity and social phobia collided with the syphilitic grandiosity. He became convinced that he was the center of a cosmic struggle. He believed that he was not just an emperor, but a magus, a spiritual gatekeeper holding back the forces of darkness. And yet he was terrified of everything. His paranoia focused sharply on his family. The House of Habsburg was a nest of vipers, even at the best of times, but in Rudolf's mind, they became demons. He was particularly fixated on his younger brother, Archduke Matthias. Matthias was ambitious, capable, and increasingly impatient with Rudolf's incompetence. Rudolf believed Matthias was trying to kill him. He refused to eat food unless it was tasted by multiple servants, and even then, he would often push the plate away, convinced that the poison was of a subtle alchemical nature that defied detection. He began to hallucinate. The spirochetes were destroying the neurons in his visual and auditory cortexes. He heard voices in the empty rooms, whispers of courtiers who had been dead for years. He saw figures standing at the foot of his bed. At night, the castle became a haunted house. He would scream at his valets to chase away the intruders, pointing at empty corners, his eyes wide with terror. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, that during this time Rudolf became obsessed with the glass delusion. This was a common psychiatric manifestation in the late Renaissance, where the sufferer believes their body is made of glass. They are terrified of being touched, terrified of sitting down too hard, convinced that they will shatter into 1,000 pieces. For Rudolf, this was the ultimate expression of his fragility. He felt brittle. He felt that the slightest pressure from the outside world, a question from a minister, a demand from the Pope, a movement of an army, would cause him to break apart. He walked with agonizing slowness, protecting his glass limbs, living in constant fear of the inevitable impact. And while the emperor shattered, the empire began to burn. Outside the walls of Prague Castle, the truce between Catholics and Protestants was unraveling. The Ottoman Turks were pressing on the borders of Hungary. The Hungarian nobility was in open revolt. The world required a strong hand, a decisive leader who could mount a horse and lead a campaign. Instead, it had a recluse who was dissolving in the dark. The Archduke Matthias saw his opportunity. He began to gather support not as a usurper, but as a savior. He positioned himself as the only man who could save the Habsburg dynasty from the madness of its head. He reached out to the Hungarian rebels, to the Austrian estates, building a coalition against his own brother. Rudolf, in his lucid moments, understood exactly what was happening. He was not stupid, he was sick. He saw the betrayal coming, but he was powerless to stop it. He could not rally an army because he could not sit on a horse. He could not give a speech because he could not articulate words without sounding like a ghoul. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own biology. By 1608, the situation had reached a breaking point. Matthias marched an army toward Prague. It was a soft coup, a family intervention, armed with muskets and pikes. Rudolf, terrified and alone, looked out from the windows of the castle and saw the campfires of his brother's troops illuminating the night sky. He had no defenders. He had alienated his court, ignored his generals, and spent the treasury on paintings and potions. The wizard emperor had no magic left. He was forced to sign a treaty, ceding the crowns of Hungary and Austria to Matthias, keeping only the title of Holy Roman Emperor and the Kingdom of Bohemia. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any surgeon's knife. But even this was not the end. The final descent was yet to come. Rudolf retreated further into the Hradčany, now a prisoner in all but name. The castle, once a beacon of enlightenment, had become a mausoleum for a man who was not yet dead. By the year 1610, the Hradčany castle had ceased to be a palace in any functional sense. It had become a labyrinth, a sprawling stone organism that breathed in secrets and exhaled paranoia. The courtyards, once filled with the bustling energy of artists, astronomers, and diplomats, were now hushed zones of exclusion. The Spanish etiquette, the rigid formal protocol that governed the Habsburg court, had warped into a bizarre ritual of avoidance. Servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, instructed to turn their faces to the wall should the emperor pass, not out of reverence, but to spare him the agony of being seen. Rudolf II, now 58 years old, was living in a state of self-imposed incarceration within the southern wing of the castle. His world had shrunk from the vast expanse of the Holy Roman Empire to a suite of 3 rooms. These rooms were kept in perpetual twilight, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the sun, for the light hurt his eyes, a symptom of the mercury that had permanently dilated his pupils and made him photophobic. In this gloom, the air was thick with the smoke of juniper berries and frankincense, burned continuously in silver braziers to combat the stench of necrotic tissue that emanated from the emperor himself. The physical devastation was now compounded by the torture of tabes dorsalis, a symptom of tertiary syphilis, where the nerve roots in the spinal cord begin to degenerate. It manifested as lightning pains, sudden, intense stabs of agony that would shoot through his abdomen and legs without warning. Imagine a hot iron being pressed into the stomach, or a knife twisted into the thigh. These attacks would leave the emperor gasping on the floor, clutching his limbs, his body rigid with shock. His physicians, helpless against the pathology of the nerves, could only offer more of the same poison that was killing him. They prescribed blue mass, a pill of mercury and licorice, and increased the dosage of laudanum to dull the pain. The result was a man who drifted in a toxic haze between agonizing lucidity and narcotic stupor. The mercury tremors had become so violent that he could no longer feed himself. A trusted valet had to spoon broth into the hole in his face, where his mouth and nose had merged, a task performed in terrifying silence, for the emperor's temper had become as brittle as his bones. It was in this state of chemical delirium that Rudolf's paranoia began to curdle into a specific weaponized madness. He became convinced that his own shadow was a separate entity, a spy sent by his brother Matthias to monitor his thoughts. He ordered mirrors to be covered or removed, unable to bear the sight of his own reflection, which he claimed shifted and changed when he wasn't looking directly at it. The magic that he had cultivated for decades, the high intellectual pursuit of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, began to degrade into something darker and more desperate. He was no longer the philosopher king seeking the unity of the cosmos. He was a frightened man looking for a protective spell. He surrounded himself with a new breed of charlatans, men who lacked the brilliance of Kepler or Dee, but possessed a cunning understanding of the emperor's fears. One such figure was Hieronymus Makowski, a valet who rose to the position of supreme confidant simply because he was willing to indulge the emperor's darkest delusions. Makowski and a rotating cast of spirit mediums held seances in the emperor's bedchamber. They would gaze into crystals or bowls of black oil, claiming to speak with angels, who promised that Rudolf would not only recover, but would be raised to a spiritual plane above all earthly kings. They fed him the lie that his suffering was not disease, but a purification, a painful alchemical calcination of the soul necessary for his final transmutation into a divine being. Rudolf clung to this narrative. It gave meaning to the meaningless rot of his body. He was not a syphilitic old man. He was a martyr of the great work. He believed that if he could just survive the fire, he would emerge as the immortal emperor, the Rex Mundi, who would unite Christendom and defeat the Antichrist, who in his mind looked suspiciously like his brother Matthias. But the reality outside the seance room was far less metaphysical. The administration of the empire had collapsed. Documents piled up unsigned on his desk. The Imperial Aulic Council, the highest court in the land, could not function because the emperor refused to appoint new judges. The machinery of state was rusting solid. The archdukes of the Habsburg family gathered in Vienna and Linz watched this paralysis with growing horror. They were not concerned with Rudolf's soul. They were concerned with the survival of the dynasty. The Ottoman Empire was mobilizing in the east. The Protestant Union in Germany was arming itself. Europe was a powder keg, and the man holding the match was hallucinating in a dark room in Prague. The pressure mounted. Archduke Matthias, having already stripped Rudolf of Austria and Hungary, now set his sights on the final prize, the Kingdom of Bohemia. He began to lobby the Bohemian estates, the powerful assembly of nobles and burghers who controlled the purse strings of the kingdom. He painted a clear picture. Rudolf was mad, unfit, and dangerous. Rudolf, sensing the noose tightening, made a catastrophic decision. It was the decision of a cornered animal, a lash out that would seal his fate. He decided that if he could not rule by law, he would rule by force, but he had no army. The Bohemian estates controlled the local militias, so he looked elsewhere. He turned to his cousin, the Archduke Leopold of Passau, a young, ambitious bishop who had an army of mercenaries at his disposal. These were the Passau men, a motley collection of professional soldiers, looters, and brigands who fought for coin, not country. In early 1611, Rudolf secretly invited this army to invade Bohemia. It was a plan of breathtaking stupidity and malice. The emperor was essentially inviting a foreign army to invade his own capital to protect him from his own subjects. He believed that Leopold's troops would march into Prague, arrest the treacherous Bohemian nobles, intimidate Matthias, and restore Rudolf's absolute authority. He imagined himself as a Caesar crossing the Rubicon. In reality, he was opening the gates to the barbarians. The Passau army, some 7,000 strong, crossed the border in January 1611. They did not behave like liberators. They behaved like locusts. They pillaged the countryside as they marched toward Prague, burning villages and raping the peasantry. When news reached the capital that an army was approaching, panic swept the city. The citizens of Prague, who had loved Rudolf for 30 years, who had benefited from his patronage and his presence, could not believe what was happening. Their father was sending wolves to eat them. On February 15th, the Passau troops reached the lesser town, Malá of Prague, directly below the castle. They broke through the gates and began to sack the city. The streets where Kepler had walked and where Archimboldo had painted ran red with blood. Mercenaries looted the churches, broke into the homes of the burghers, and set fire to the shops. From the high windows of the Radceni, Rudolf watched the smoke rising from the city below. The landscape of his mind at this moment was twisted. Did he feel a surge of triumph? Did he believe he was finally asserting his power? Or did the mercury-induced dissociation detach him completely from the horror he had unleashed? Witnesses described him pacing the long gallery of the castle, dressed in a bizarre mishmash of armor and velvet robes, holding a sword he was too weak to lift, muttering that he would purify the city. He was manic, energized by the violence, fueled by the adrenaline that briefly overrode the syphilis. He believed the flames down below were the fires of his alchemical furnace, burning away the impurities of his realm, but the reaction was not submission, it was fury. The people of Prague rose up. The burghers armed themselves. The Bohemian estates called out their own militias. Even the Dutch and Venetian ambassadors took up muskets to defend their embassies. The Passau troops found themselves trapped in the narrow, winding streets of the lesser town, fighting a vicious urban war against the very citizens they were supposed to be subjugating. Within days, the tide turned. Matthias, seeing his chance, marched his own army toward Prague, this time positioned as the savior of the city against the mad emperor and his mercenaries. The Passau troops, realizing they were about to be crushed between the angry citizens and Matthias's professional army, took their loot and fled. Rudolf was left alone in the castle, stripped of his last gamble. The silence returned, but this time it was the silence of the grave. He had played his final card, violence, and it had blown up in his face. The endgame began in March 1611. The Bohemian estates, now fully aligned with Matthias, demanded Rudolf's abdication. There were no negotiations this time. There was no respect for the imperial dignity. A delegation of nobles marched into the castle, past the cowering servants, and entered the emperor's private chambers. They found a wreck. Rudolf was seated in a chair, wrapped in blankets, his face hidden in the shadows. The smell of the room was overpowering. When they read the act of abdication to him, a document that stripped him of the Bohemian crown and left him with nothing but the empty title of Holy Roman Emperor and a pension, he did not argue. The fight had drained out of him, along with the mercury-laden saliva that dripped onto his chest. But there was a moment, recorded by history, where the old fire flickered one last time. When the document was placed before him to sign, Rudolf hesitated. He looked at the quill in his trembling hand. He looked at the nobles, men whose fathers he had known, men whose families he had elevated. He reportedly stood up, shaking violently, and walked to the window. He looked out over the city of Prague, the spires, the red roofs, the winding Vltava river. "Prague," he whispered, his voice a ruined rasp through his collapsed palate. "Ungrateful Prague, I made you famous, I made you beautiful, and now you cast me out." He turned back and signed the paper. The signature was a jagged, illegible scrawl, the mark of a man whose nervous system had betrayed him. With that stroke of the pen, he ceased to be the king of Bohemia. He was now a guest in his own house, a tenant in the palace he had built. The months that followed were a purgatory. Matthias was crowned king of Bohemia with great pomp and celebration. The church bells rang out across the city, bells that Rudolf could hear from his window. The court, the sycophants, the artists, and the astronomers flocked to the new king. The sun had set. A new, more practical sun had risen. Rudolf remained in the castle, but his territory was reduced even further. He was confined to a few rooms in the north wing. His collection, the Kunstkammer, remained technically his, but he rarely visited it. The objects that had once given him such joy now seemed like mocking reminders of his failure. The clockwork automata still ticked. The stuffed bird still stared with glass eyes, but the animating spirit was gone. His health entered a precipitous decline. The stress of the abdication had triggered a massive flare-up of the syphilis. The gummas on his skull multiplied. He developed deep ulcerating sores on his legs that went down to the bone. The pain was constant and blinding. He spent his days in a drugged stupor, terrified of assassination. He believed that Matthias would not be content with the crown. He would want the life. Rudolf refused to eat anything that wasn't prepared by his old valet, and even then, he would make the valet eat half of it first and wait an hour to see if he died. He slept with a dagger under his pillow, a pathetic defense for a man who could barely lift a spoon. The lion's court became a focal point of his final obsession. In the moat of the castle, Rudolf had kept a menagerie of wild animals, including lions, tigers, and a famous leopard. He had always felt a kinship with the lions, symbols of imperial power, caged and restless. Now, he would spend hours staring out the window at the lion pit. There was one lion in particular, a magnificent male that had been a gift from the Ottoman Sultan years ago. Rudolf had named it Mohammed. He had a superstitious belief, fed by Tycho Brahe's horoscopes decades earlier, that his life was linked to this lion. When the lion dies, the prophecy went, the eagle will fall. In these final months, Rudolf ordered daily reports on the lion's health. He cared more about the lion's diet than his own. When the lion seemed lethargic, the emperor would fall into a panic, summoning veterinarians and alchemists to treat the beast. It was a projection of his own failing vitality. He saw himself in the cage, once a king of beasts, now mangy, pacing and waiting for the end. The nights were the worst. The neurosyphilis induced insomnia of the soul. He could not sleep, yet he was not fully awake. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl around the spires of St. Vitus Cathedral. In the deprivation of sensory input, his mind filled the void with horrors. He saw the faces of the men he had killed, the women he had bedded, and the children he had never legitimized. But most of all, he saw the face of God, and it was not a kindly face. Rudolf had spent his life trying to understand God through science and magic, trying to decode the divine mind. Now at the end, he feared he had only annoyed the Almighty. He had pried too deep. He had touched the forbidden fruit of knowledge, and like Adam, he was being cast out. But his expulsion was not into a world of labor. It was into a body of rot. By late 1611, he was rotting alive. The smell in his room was so potent that servants would vomit after leaving. The flesh of his legs was gangrenous. His breath was a weapon. He was a biological hazard, a singularity of disease. Yet, incredibly, his heart kept beating. The Habsburg constitution, bred for stubborn survival, refused to give up. He was trapped in the wreckage, unable to die, unable to live. He stopped speaking almost entirely. The effort to articulate words through his ruined mouth was too great, and he had nothing left to say to a world that had rejected him. He communicated in gestures, a pointed finger, a wave of the hand, a grimace of pain. The wizard emperor had become a silent gargoyle. By January of 1612, the silence in the northern wing of the Hradčany had become absolute. The clocks that Rudolf had spent a lifetime collecting, hundreds of them, ticking in discordant unison, had mostly wound down. The servants, exhausted and terrified by the erratic moods of the dying emperor, had stopped winding them. Time, which Rudolf had tried so desperately to measure and control with his brass gears and mathematical tables, had finally lost its meaning. There was only the long, suffocating now of the deathbed. The emperor was 59 years old, but the creature gasping for air in the velvet chair looked ancient. He could no longer lie down. The syphilis had ravaged his heart valves and liver, leading to a condition known then as dropsy, severe edema. His legs were swollen to the size of tree trunks, the skin shiny and taut, weeping clear fluid from cracks that refused to heal. Fluid had filled his lungs, meaning that if he lay flat, he would drown in his own secretions. So he sat propped up by pillows, head lolling back, fighting for every breath with a wet, rattling sound that echoed through the cold room. The smell was now a physical presence. It was the scent of gangrene. The ulcers on his legs had turned black and necrotic. The gummas in his nasal cavity had advanced to the point where the soft tissue of his face was collapsing inward. To enter the emperor's chamber was an act of physical endurance. His valets, men like Hieronymus Makowski, who had profited from his delusions, now performed their duties with handkerchiefs tied around their faces, their eyes watering from the stench of a living man decomposing. Rudolf was conscious, but he was no longer in Prague. The neurosyphilis, combined with the toxic accumulation of mercury in his brain, had severed the final tethers to reality. He was hallucinating vividly. In the flickering candlelight, the shadows of the bedposts transformed into the alchemical symbols he had studied for 40 years. He saw the green lion devouring the sun. He saw the red king rising from the putrefaction. For decades, Rudolf had sought the opus magnum, the great work. He had believed that through the purification of matter one could achieve immortality. Now, in the delirium of terminal illness, his broken mind began to interpret his own agony as the final stage of that alchemical process. The burning pain in his bones was the calcinatio, the burning away of impurities. The fluid drowning his lungs was the solutio, the dissolution of the ego. He was not dying, he was transmuting. He whispered to people who weren't there. He held long, one-sided conversations with Tycho Brahe, the great astronomer who had died at his table a decade earlier. He argued with his grandfather, Charles V. He pleaded with the ghost of his youth. The handsome prince he had been before the French disease had turned him into a monster. "The stone," he would rasp, his voice a hollow whistle through his ruined palate. "Where is the stone? I need the red powder." His physicians, helpless and horrified, continued the charade. They brought him potable gold, flakes of gold leaf suspended in oil, and poured it down his throat. They applied poultices of crushed emeralds to his gangrenous legs. It was a grotesquely expensive futility. The gold did not knit the bone. The emeralds did not stop the rot. The emperor was consuming the wealth of his empire in a literal sense, swallowing fortunes in a desperate bid to buy one more hour of life. Outside the door, the vultures were circling. The court had already moved on to Matthias. The corridors were empty of the sycophants who had once fought for a glance from Rudolf. Now only the looters remained. Servants were quietly stealing silverware, tapestries, and small scientific instruments, slipping them under their cloaks as they left the room. The emperor, who had possessed the greatest collection in Europe, was being picked clean before he was even cold. On the night of January 19th, the end began in earnest. The emperor's breathing changed. It shifted into the terrifying rhythm known as Cheney-Stokes respiration, a pattern of deep, fast breathing followed by long, agonizing pauses of apnea where the patient appears dead, only to gasp back into life with a sudden, violent snort. It is a sound that haunts anyone who has sat a death watch. For the valets in the room, it was psychological torture. Every time the breathing stopped, they would tense, waiting for the silence to stretch into eternity. Then the gasp would come, a wet, desperate intake of air, and the suffering would continue. Rudolf's eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. The pupils were blown wide, black holes that absorbed the candlelight. What was he seeing? Was he looking at the painted frescoes of the heavens? Or was he seeing the true face of the universe he had tried to master? A cold, indifferent void where stars burn and bodies rot, and no amount of magic can stop the entropy? He had spent his life building a barrier of art and science against the chaos of the world. He had collected beauty to hide the ugliness of his own genetics. He had collected knowledge to hide his fear of the unknown. But in the end, the chaos had breached the walls. It was inside him. It was him. In the early hours of January 20th, 1612, the rhythm broke. The gasp became shallower. The fluid in his lungs rose higher, a rising tide of his own making. The mercurial tremors that had shaken his body for years finally began to subside, not because of a cure, but because the muscles no longer had the energy to twitch. At around 7 in the morning, just as the winter sun was beginning to gray the windows of the Hradzhany, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia, King of Hungary, Archduke of Austria, Rudolf II exhaled a final rattling breath. The chest fell and did not rise. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, not with grief, but with relief. The monster in the high tower was gone. The embarrassment was over. The Habsburg dynasty could breathe again. Almost immediately, the machinery of death took over. The body was stripped of its soiled night clothes. The physicians, who had been useless in life, now prepared to perform their final duty, the autopsy. In the 17th century, autopsies on royals were standard, partly to embalm the body and partly to confirm that no foul play, poison, had occurred, though in Rudolf's case he had been poisoning himself for years. The autopsy report of Rudolf II is a document of stark clinical horror that validates every whisper, every rumor that had circulated about him in life. When the surgeons opened his chest, they found a heart that was described as shriveled and flaccid, surrounded by a pericardium filled with water. His lungs were black and hardened. His liver was corrupted and full of stones. But the most telling finding was in the brain. When they sawed through the skull, the bone likely softened by the syphilis, they found the dura mater, the membrane covering the brain, adhered tightly to the skull cap, a classic sign of chronic inflammation. The brain itself was described as full of water, hydrocephalus, and showing signs of atrophy. The physical evidence was undeniable. The emperor had not been eccentric. He had not been merely melancholic. He had been a victim of massive systemic biological devastation. The mercury had shredded his kidneys and nerves. The syphilis had eaten his bones and his brain. He was a medical curiosity, a specimen that belonged in one of his own jars of formaldehyde. They removed his heart and his intestines, placing them in separate silver vessels as per tradition. The hollowed-out shell of the emperor was then washed, stuffed with aromatic herbs to combat the stench of gangrene, and wrapped in cerecloth, waxed linen. He was dressed in his ceremonial robes, the collar of the golden fleece placed around his neck to hide the ruin of his throat, the crown placed on his head to distract from the ravaged face. For the first time in years, Rudolf looked peaceful. The pain was gone. The paranoia was gone. The glass man had finally shattered, and the pieces had been swept away. The silence in the Hrachani did not last. The 30 Years' War, kindled by Rudolf's weakness, eventually returned to Prague. In 1648, the Swedish army stormed the castle. They didn't come for territory. They came for the loot. The sack of the Kunstkammer was a brutal lobotomy. Soldiers smashed the automata, stole the paintings, and scattered the emperor's lifework across the continent. The unity he sought was shattered, mirroring the destruction of his own body. But while the art was stolen, the evidence of the crime remained. In 20th century examinations of the crypt, researchers analyzed the dust of the emperor's burial clothes. The velvet had rotted, but the gold threads remained, and clinging to those threads were high concentrations of mercury. The metal did not evaporate. It did not transmute. It bound itself to his bones in a permanent, toxic embrace. The cure outlasted the patient. It outlasted the empire. Rudolf II, the alchemist emperor, finally achieved his synthesis. He became one with the metal he loved. He is no longer a man. He is a cautionary element in the periodic table of history. And in the silence of the cathedral, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. Tick, 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 not a clock, but the sound of a drop of mercury falling into a silver bowl, forever measuring the time of a man who ran out of it long ago,